Welcome, friends, to this conversation with historian Dan Royles, moderated by the Reverend Duncan Teague. I am Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of today's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Secondly, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ+ persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in LGBTQ religious history. One of the primary ways we encourage scholarship is through our annual award for papers. We started the LGBTQ Religious History Award in 2005, and it remains the only academic award for research into LGBTQ religious history. Dan Royles became the 12th recipient of this award this year. His paper, There is a Balm in Gilead, AIDS Activism in the Black Church, was selected by the jury of reviewers from among 10 papers submitted for this year's award. Dan Royles is Assistant Professor of History at Florida International University, where he teaches courses on United States, African American, LGBTQ, oral and public history. His first book, To Make the Wounded Whole, The African American Struggle Against HIV/AIDS, published last September, offers the first history of African American AIDS activism in all of its depth and breadth. His award-winning paper was drawn from one chapter in this book, and it describes the work of the Balm in Gilead, an organization that works with Black churches around the world on AIDS education and prevention programs. Drawing from an interview with the Balm in Gilead's founder, Pernessa Seal, and other sources, the paper describes the group's origins in New York City in 1989 as the Harlem Week of Prayer for the Healing of AIDS, and its move during the late 1990s to address AIDS in Africa through partnership with faith leaders in 5 African countries. Dan will be interviewed by the Reverend Duncan Teague, who is the founding minister of the 3-year-old Abundant Love Unitarian Universalist Congregation in Atlanta, Georgia. He has served on the National UU Ministers Committee on Anti-Racism, Anti-Oppression, and Multiculturalism. Reverend Teague also provides advice and assistance on research to inform faith-based HIV/AIDS prevention programs from the perspective of Black, gay, and bisexual men. Duncan is also a senior member of the Performance Poets, the Adodi Muse, a gay Negro ensemble, and his narrative is featured in the award-winning book, documentary, and stage productions of Sweet Tea, an anthology of Black gay men's lives in the South by E. Patrick Johnson. Dan, I congratulate you on receiving the 2020-21 LGBTQ Religious History Award. I look forward to hearing Duncan talk with you about your journey as a scholar in queer history and religion, and where and how your research has unfolded. To those of you watching the Zoom webinar, we welcome your comments in the chat box and your questions for Dan or Duncan in the Q&A function. There will be a time to ask your questions toward the end of today's program. Please direct any technical concerns to Asadi Toyamba Ford, who is the tech manager for this webinar. Now, I am pleased to welcome Dan Royles and Duncan Teague.
Thank you, Mark.
Good evening, everyone. Dan, wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And
I'm
for our friends who are coming in, I have known Dan for a while, so I will not be calling him Dr. Royles. We already got that cleared up. I want to
yeah,
also thank, while we're starting out, the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network for doing this. Our history is in attics, it's in basements, it's going out in the garage, it's going away in garage sales. And I'm so glad that somebody is collecting us digitally and doing the work they're doing. It's wonderful, and I'm so proud to be a part of this. Um, Shameless plug, I also have my own archive. Uh, so, so don't throw out the history. Don't throw it out. That's for our audience. Because I know you're working on your archive, Dan, right? Already.
yeah. No, I would absolutely, endorse what Duncan just said. Part of the reason that the way that Duncan and I got to know each other and be friends is that I spent a lot of time doing research in Duncan's papers, which was the Auburn Avenue Research Library in Atlanta. They were one of the first collections that I got to research in for this project. And so I kind of got to know Duncan that way. And then, through oral history, and we did a panel together
Yeah.
in 2014 at Emory. We've gotten to be friends, outside of the research too. So, yeah.
Well, Dan, this is a wonderful honor. And I read the chapter along with the chapters from stuff that I was involved with. And I love the book.
Thank you.
It is hard for me to read a little bit, so we'll get to that part later. Let's find
Yeah.
out who Dan is first. Like, I am very curious, and some other folks might be, about how you become a historian of
Mhm.
queer history and Black history and AIDS history. How do you can get a job doing that now? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and part of the reason that you can get a job as, a historian of the queer past is because of, all the folks that came before and built up the ground for us to have, not only people being hired in those positions, but to have an active, scholarly community through the Committee on LGBT History. So folks like, um, you know, John D'Amelio and George Chauncey. I'm a little bit loath to start naming names because then I'm going to leave somebody out, and I
Yeah.
don't want to upset anybody. But just that whole really generation of scholars starting in the late 70s, definitely through the 80s and 90s, built up the ground for people like me to be able to be in a position that I'm in and to tell these stories. Um,
And you won't
so
get kicked out of school for saying you're going to do this.
not yet. They
Not
haven't kicked
now.
me out yet. Knock on wood.
Was
Uh,
was there something in your early history that said you might go this way?
you mean the history persuasion?
No, I mean, yes, the history persuasion and how you're doing it.
um, I I didn't really like history when I was in like elementary and middle and really early high school. It wasn't until I took AP US history as a junior that I think I really started to enjoy it. And then I went to college and I was an architecture major for a year, and dropped out of that. I missed writing papers and thinking about the world in that way. And at the same time, I was in college and I was also coming out. And, so those kind of two things were really closely entwined for me. And so I, became more interested in queer history, but just kind of, histories of the body and the way that people's understandings of identity and community and politics get mapped onto the body in different ways. So, whether that's through understandings about race or sexuality or, health and medicine, those are all things that were really interesting to me. I should say, also on the subject of academic generations, when I was in college, I remember reading David K. Johnson's The Lavender Scare, which is about the persecution of gays and lesbians as part of the Red Scare. And that book was really, I think, that if there's one book that made me want to be a historian, it was that book that made me want to be a historian. Yeah. So, I went to grad school at Temple in Philadelphia. Not necessarily with the idea that African American history was going to be a key part of my work. And it was really through this project that it came to be, because it was finding the story that became chapter 1 of the book, which is about a group called Babashi, Blacks Educating Blacks About Sexual Health Issues. And Rashida Hassan, then Rashida Hassan, now she's Rashida Abdul Kabir, who's a Black Muslim nurse who wears a headscarf. And she was, doing outreach in Black gay bars in 1985 in Philly.
Yes.
And also fighting against some of the, what by then had become the AIDS service establishment in Philly, which is mostly white gay men, really kind of located in Center City, which is in many ways a hostile space for Black gay men and other gay men of color. And it was like that story of Rashida, who, exploded my ideas about what an AIDS activist looks like and where you find them and what they do. And then that tension between race and sexuality in the gayborhood, in the way that people were contesting, over resources, and also contesting, what it meant to be Black and gay in that context. All those things were just eye-opening and so interesting to me. And it was, that got me started and looking for other stories like that. And that's how I found stories like the story of the Balm of Gilead, and came to write the chapter that is this essay.
Yeah. I have my questions here, and I'm going to go with what I'm feeling, because as you're saying these names, as you're describing what's going on, I'm having flashbacks.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was a very young, for those viewing, very young person, meeting these people, hearing these arguments, trying to make sense of them and my life and the different parts of my life, because I was already out by then. I'd already had an established gay life that intersected not just Black gay space, but white gay space, and male and female queer space, and learning about it as I was doing it. And then I learned about HIV, because I'm fortunate enough to be a pre-epidemic queen. Anyway, so one of the things that I'm curious about is, like, for me, reading your book, especially the chapter in Balm and Gilead, I had some emotional stuff around grieving people for whom you're writing about, because you have found their stories. They were my friends. Have you gotten any interaction about, like, delving into the personal and the personal political histories and the effective histories that are, for a lot of us, cause grief when we think about them or when we're interacting with your book?
Yeah. I haven't really had much chance to interact with people, unfortunately, since the book came out.
Oh, that's right, because your book comes out in the midst of this other epidemic.
Yeah. You know, one thing about this book and this work is like, I want it to be less relevant than it is, because I want us to be in a place where we're not living through like cascading epidemics that, you know, disproportionately affect communities of color. But that's where we are.
That's where we are.
That's where we are. You know, I did a lot of oral history interviewing for the book, and those can be really emotional. Definitely had people cry while telling their stories. I definitely cried while people told me their stories. And being in the archive and reading the material, can be really emotional as well. It's very heavy, and I'm very aware of how much grief is bound up in this history, for a lot of the people, for all the people that show up in the book. And as I was writing, I tried to keep that in mind.
I know this isn't supposed to be like where I just give you compliment after compliment, but you won an award for this. And so I'm going to say that the reading that I did so far really honors our stories.
Thank you.
And as a Black...
that means a lot to me.
Yeah. And as a Black gay man, having lived through it, I mean, I was really like, not a kid, but I thought I was a kid. Still, when I met a lot of these people and when I interacted with them, and in many cases when I lost them, I was still young. I want to know about Dan's family, because we've tiptoed into, how you handled the emotional piece, how you are really respectfully holding on to stories that are not yours. In some ways they are. And you've chosen to do that. Was there anything in the family that helped you with that, or was that something you gained later? And who is the family of Dan Royles?
I mean, we all have, we as gay people, we all have biological family. We all have chosen family, right? And in a way, I think that, there's a kind of familial connection or fellowship that you get with people when you sit down with them and create the space for them to share their life stories. And so the thing I think that was really transformative for me, both with this project, but in ways that really shaped me personally, was the process of doing oral history. That process drew me deeper and deeper into the project, and I think invested the project with a really strong sense of care for how I was going to write the book. One of the ways that I think about me in relation to these stories, which, as you rightly pointed out, in a big way are kind of not mine, right? It is not obvious. I'm very white. We are excessively European people. Although I do like season my food well. That's one thing. But it was really like the process of doing oral history, I think, that invested or led me to invest or pushed me to invest like a lot of care in the writing of the history.
Dan, did you, while you're holding on to that thought, did you
Yeah.
grow up around a family that did a whole lot of storytelling?
Yeah, actually. It's funny that you should ask that. I do remember being very young and just continuously pestering parents and step parents and aunts and uncles to tell me stories about our family. And that may be, kind of a function of having some like larger than life characters in our family. But I really remember asking like to the point I'm sure of irritation on the part of my parents to tell me stories about our family. So yeah, that's not something that I've really thought a lot about, but maybe there's something there
So
about the
you were
impulse
already
to.
collecting oral histories, maybe not in the best way.
I mean, definitely not, according to the best practices of the Oral History Association. And definitely some of those oral histories probably could use some fact checking. But,
Okay.
but yeah.
I saw that we have a question from the chat, and I'm holding
Sure.
on to it because
Okay.
it was one of my questions too.
Okay.
And so, just real quick, like, are you the oldest of 7? Are you one of 2? Where do you fall in your family lineup?
I am my parents' only child, and then I have 2 half sisters who are 13 years younger than me.
Wow.
So I am kind of an only child, kind of an oldest child.
Okay. We're curious because you went a long time doing this book, and
Yes.
you went into like some deep places, deep in my archives and other people's stories. I know that some of them were emotional, but what were some of the obstacles that you faced trying to put this book together for 10 years?
Yeah. You know, one obstacle is an archival obstacle. So, for some of these stories, there's not one archive that you can go to and find everything you need to find about, especially a group like Balm and Gilead. So, I interviewed Pernessa Seal, Dr. Seal. Balm and Gilead was able to give me some documents, not a huge number. And so, the rest of the story got pieced together from, archival stuff that's here and there. There were some things, in your papers, but also in the GMHC papers, in the NTFAP paper, the National Task Force papers. It was really kind of like picking out from different
And
places,
for
like
our
what
audience, GMHC is,
gay men's health crisis.
in New
Yeah.
York.
Yeah. So, just kind of like Magpie, like putting together, the little bit that we have here and there. I'll say that the LGBTQ Religious Archive Network has some great oral histories that were really useful for just giving a kind of personal dimension to the ways that Black gay people, men and women, kind of experienced homophobia within the church. And then I was also able to use a tool from the Internet Archive called the Wayback Machine that lets you look at old versions of a web page over time. So when the Balm and Gilead goes on the 5 African countries tour, they had basically a blog. I don't know if we called it a blog then, but basically kept a blog. And that was really interesting for seeing how they were talking about that trip in very explicitly diasporic terms. So like, talking about how people as they're going to, Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania, people are saying, oh, welcome home, welcoming Pernessa Seal as an Igbo woman. And, really kind of interesting terms that they're putting that in. that really served the argument of the book very well. So, this chapter especially was a kind of like exquisite corpse of stuff from all over the place. But that's definitely a challenge that I faced in other chapters as well. I did research in, I don't even remember how many states, like LA, San Francisco, Philly, New York, Atlanta, a little bit in Chicago, and then a lot of digital research, a lot of oral history research.
Okay, so now you
Yeah.
talk about that as though it was a tour, but it was a 10-year journey.
Yes.
So was part of the challenge just the travel?
Yeah, was a big challenge. I'm lucky in that some of those places are places that I visit regularly. So some of my chosen family is in San Francisco. So,
Okay.
and the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention papers are there. So, that was something where it was like, I can go and, go to the archive during the day when my friends are at work, and, and that's cool. That works. My dad lives in LA, and there's a bunch of Black and white men together, oral histories and some papers at USC in the one archive. So that worked out very well. And so that's, where I was able to pull some material for the chapter on the National Task Force. And yeah, then, I like to get back to Philly a lot. When I was in grad school, New York was pretty accessible. But yeah, the travel was a little bit of a grind sometimes. And archival research itself is not the easiest thing to do. Spend 8 hours looking at papers is really fun. But it can take a toll on your mind and your body. But I am at the end of the day really, really grateful to be in a position where I can do that as my job.
Exactly.
I absolutely love research, the process of research and writing, and I mean, I just feel tremendously blessed to be able to tell these stories and have it be something like a living.
That's wonderful. I want to check in on the time because our hosts have been so generous. Mark, can you tell us how much time we have left?
We can go another 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions and answers.
Wow, I knew this was going to happen. Okay, so I'm going to give you my big question. And my big question, and because we are at the network of religious queer history, not just queer history, you devoted a lot of time and energy to the Balm in Gilead, which is, goes deep into Black church and HIV and Dr. Seals. I knew her as Pernessa. Her work. And then you even titled the book based on the verse in there, and to make the wounded whole. Okay, so what's your religious background, and how come Black church and Black religious stuff gets this kind of heft in your work?
So all of my religious background is, I was raised Methodist. My dad grew up Episcopalian and converted to Catholicism when I was a kid. I'm an atheist, personally, but I'm an atheist, but I really value the inspiration that other people take from religious belief and from faith to do good things. I think at an earlier point in my life, I had a much more sour view of what it meant to be a person of faith. And that has changed, because I see that faith can inspire people to do bad things, and faith can inspire people to do really good things. And I focus on the really good things that faith can inspire people to do. I think that there's a lot of things that I do in my personal and professional life that are nevertheless rooted in faith. I mean, being a teacher is an act of faith. You are planting seeds in students' minds that you're probably never going to see the payoff from the teaching that you do, or you might never, but you do it anyway because you think it's important. You have faith that it might, there will be a payoff. When we do political work, which I do, quite a bit of outside of my academic work, we do that because we believe that it's important, and we have faith that we can individually and collectively do big things, that we can have a major impact on, policy or elections or, what have you. So, I think of those, even though I don't believe in the way that other folks might, like, I do see those as acts of faith.
So you are writing a book.
Yes.
About
which is also an act of faith.
and for 10 years. And then when it comes time to title it, you take a faith statement and put it on the cover.
Yeah.
What happened there?
I was really struggling with what to call the book. The dissertation was called something else. I think it was called Don't We Die Too, which is taken from another, from a document that I found. And once the title kind of clicked for me, and I thought of To Make the Wounded Whole as a title, I felt like it really couldn't have been titled anything else, because that captures so well the argument of the book, which is about the way that Black AIDS activists renegotiated and reframed ideas about Black community and Black identity in ways that made parts that were wounded whole, in terms of the rejection of queer people. And then, the kind of diasporic element of, if we think of AIDS as one of the afterlives of slavery, or as part of the afterlife of slavery, to use a term from Sadia Hartman, who won the MacArthur Genius Grant last year, and does brilliant work. If we think of AIDS as part of the afterlife of slavery, and slavery as a wound, then part of this work is making that wound whole. And so, that line from the spiritual could kind of encapsulate that, meant that it had to be the title of the book. Once I realized that, I felt like I had no choice.
We have eaten up our time, and I'm going to sneak in this question because it came from the chat. So okay. I'm negotiating. I'm renegotiating here, as Black gay folks always have to do.
Yeah.
And it's from a buddy of mine, so I'm going to acknowledge Reverend Harry Knox. And there's a historical story there that you cannot print while we're both alive. But anyway, Harry wants to know about the matriarchal leadership in the Black church community, and how that came up or didn't in your work, or did that, because Pernessa's obviously a very powerful Black woman, and she does this thing that nobody else is doing.
Yeah. I will say that one thing that is very striking about not just this story, but several of the stories, is how central Black women were to a lot of this work. And that is not to take away from of course, the really important, vital work that Black gay men also did. But, it's pretty striking in a way that was not by design that Black women are central to so many of the stories in the book. Rashida Hassan, Pernessa Cecile, Daisy Dixon Diallo. In chapter 6, Wahida Shabazel.
Let me affirm for you that
Yeah.
in the worst days of the epidemic, it was Black queers and Black women trying to deal with this thing. Because I was there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to affirm that for you.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about what I read.
Yeah. Right. No, I know. And, so I think that's just really striking. I think that pushes us to, as just the project of talking about Black AIDS activism does, pushes us even more to rethink really basic things about our public collective narrative of AIDS activism in this country, because it's one that centers neither African Americans nor women, and especially not Black women. And if we're going to go even farther, especially not Black women in the church, especially not Black Muslim women. But off the top of my head, Wahida Shabazel, Rashida Hassan, Katrina Haslip, and not to mention the ways in which the Black church gets talked about when we talk about AIDS and Black communities is almost never positive. It's almost always the Black church is homophobic, and that is why there is so much AIDS in Black communities. No,
that's not the whole story.
Are some Black churches homophobic? Yes, in the way that some churches are homophobic.
Thank you.
But to say that the Black church is uniquely homophobic or uniquely, responsible for, disparities in an epidemic that we know is about a lot more. That's about mass incarceration. That's about racial capitalism. That's about systemic anti-Blackness, and on and on and on. Is really a terrible dodge for the rest of those things. And so, is one reason, I think, to go back to answer a question that you asked a couple minutes ago, why this book had to have a chapter on the Balm in Gilead. Just not to mention that it's a really interesting story.
Yes.
And one that's been really important to the bigger story of Black AIDS activism. I mean, it's an organization that's very long lasting, and has been quite influential. So, they had to be in here. They're not the only story of Black church responses to AIDS. Like, we still need articles or essays or books or book chapters on the Ark of Refuge, on SCLC women, which as soon as Emory opens back up, I want to go into the SCLC women papers because they're there. And they only just got there a couple of years ago, and that's just to name a few. I know there's tons more. So, we need lots more stories like these. One thing that I say in the book that I believe very strongly is, like, this is a book about African American AIDS activism. It is not the book. It is not an exhaustive history. It tells 7 stories that I think are very compelling and important, but there are many, 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 many more.
And we are going to get so in trouble if we don't start taking questions. Are we going to get help, or do I need to read from the chat?
We currently don't have any additional questions. If you'd like to continue along your list, we don't have any at the moment.
Duncan, you're doing just a great job of anticipating people's questions. And so...
Okay. Oh, I know what a good one here. We'll go back to the 10-year journey.
Sure.
And we're going to get spiritual, Mr. Atheist. I also know that we wouldn't have had the film Amistad unless Debbie Allen was willing to get in the trenches and stay there for 10 years. 10 years to make one film. 10 years to get and to make The Wounded Whole. What sustained you?
Oh, I mean, for me, I have to say, like, there was like a professional need for me to do it. Like, I couldn't, if I had walked away from it at any point, it would have meant, walking away from an academic career. That's part of it. To be really honest. But actually, I think the thing more than anything that times when I was doubting the project or feeling down about it, really doing oral history brought me back to it.
Wow.
Really honestly, like,
I want you to write a letter to your family, because this thing about oral history is deep.
But I can think of times that, like, I was kind of struggling professionally and, not sure that I had made any good choices. And, going and interviewing folks just brought me back to the human dimension of it, to the gravity of it, to the importance of it, and made me feel good about it. Even when those histories were really heavy, it was just a recentering on what was important about the project. That really sustained me. And I'll also say, I really, especially kind of in the last, there was a time very early on when I was still figuring it out, when I felt very daunted by the project. And this is not uncommon, I think, for academics. Like, whenever you're working on something, every other project seems more attractive than the thing that you're working on. And it was definitely true early on. But, especially once I had my degree in hand, once I, wrote the dissertation, and once I was revising it for it as a book, I really enjoyed writing it. There was so much to kind of uncover, especially as I was processing research. And I am a very kind of I don't know, type A like researcher, and I think I catalog so much stuff about sources that I ended up never using. But part of something that came out of that was being able to see connections across the chapters, across the archives, across the stories, to where, like, you see somebody showing up, see George Bellinger show up here and here.
Yes.
And here.
Yes.
And that's really interesting. And what that pointed me toward was like, there is really a dense network here of people and organizations who are all in conversation with each other. And this personally. But one of my favorite things, favorite sources that I ever came across was not one that I came across in an archive. It was one that Rashida shared with me personally. It was a letter from Reggie to Rashida from Amsterdam in 1995. It was just like a really nice kind of personal letter about how much he valued her and their friendship, and and that connected two stories for me that where the connection wasn't so obvious, at least to me at that time. Later, I was able to build some more into that and see, how Babashi was hosting hot, horny, and healthy workshops, and they were working with BWMT Philadelphia, at least for a couple of years. But that just gave me a different kind of perspective on, these aren't people who are just working together. They're people who really valued each other.
Yes.
And found, I think, a space for community and connection in a context where, they were fighting battles on multiple fronts.
Yes.
And
we knew
so
it. And we knew we had to watch out for each other for the most part. Yeah. Um, the what is that called? The oh, that's a buddy of mine. I'm so glad she's
Oh,
here.
good. Hi, Francis.
I wanted to say because you took me down a lane when you talked about Reggie, because Reggie Williams, founder with Phil and Steve Feebeck of the National Task Force on AIDS Prevention, many years after we lost Reggie, I am in Amsterdam for the first time, and this is only about 3-4 years ago. And who is a tour guide for me and my husband but Reggie's partner, surviving partner.
Mm-hmm.
And so after all these years, like almost 20 years, Reggie's significant other still is hosting us, as though Reggie is standing right there with us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those connections were real and they're deep.
Yeah.
You did something subliminal.
Okay.
While you were talking about what sustained you, and you kept playing with your wedding ring.
Ha.
And so we are going to credit your husband whether you want to or not. Because your fingers and your hands were like, yeah, he's in this.
Yeah, that's fair. Definitely my partner Darwin has been a sustaining force for the past couple of years. Definitely as I was finishing this project. One of the of course I was way over deadline for turning in the full manuscript. I think I was supposed to have it in like August 2018, and it got in May 2019. And all of spring 2019, I was on.
I want you to focus in on the verb "got it in."
Submitted.
Thank you.
But no, I was on leave all spring 2019 was to work on the book, and you know I'm on the tenure clock, so I was trying to finish that, and we were getting ready to go on a trip in like May, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's another historian, and she was like, you have to finish this before you leave on this trip, otherwise you're going to be miserable. And she was right, and I submitted it right before we went on the trip, and it was fantastic. So but that whole semester when I was probably a crazy person, Darwin helps quite a bit. He also came with me into the archive in Philadelphia and got to help me do some research, which was fantastic.
Yes.
And there he is. He's popping up just over my shoulder.
Mark, I know it's time. And I knew this was going to happen.
Well, thank you so much, Duncan and Teague. But Dan, let's just hear just about what's next for you. You've alluded to things that have been attractive to you. Where do you see your next round of research going?
So I'm working on a second book right now. It is in some ways pretty different. It is a social, cultural, and intellectual biography of Claude Brown, who wrote a book called Man, Child, and the Promised Land. It came out in the 60s. The memoir of growing up in Harlem in the 40s and 50s. It has quite a bit of religious content because, a lot of the book is kind of Claude Brown, or the fictionalized version of Claude Brown, experiencing his mother's religion, which is a very kind of down home Southern religion that came up from the Great Migration, at the same time that he is encountering Coptics in Harlem and the Nation of Islam in Harlem. So there's some religious content to it, less queer content, although as I'm rereading it, there are some aspects of it that make it kind of a queer book. So it's a little bit maybe of a departure from the first book,
Mhm.
but one that I'm really excited about. I think it's going to be a really fun project to work on.
And is there something beyond that on the horizon?
Oh God.
Mhm.
I would like to write a big book about ACT UP. And I know I just said a thing about how, you know, we need to like revise our narratives about AIDS history. But I think a big book about ACT UP can do that, because a lot of what we know about ACT UP is really about ACT UP New York. And at the peak of, you know, ACT UP as an organization, there were 100 chapters in the United States and worldwide. I mean, there was ACT UP Shreveport. I write about ACT UP Philadelphia in the book, which is a very different story from the ACT UP New York story. There was ACT UP Paris. There were folks from ACT UP going to help organize folks in South Africa in the late 90s. I mean, there is a whole kind of ACT UP diaspora and set of generations that we just don't know enough about. And I would really like to write a book that dives into that history and tells, again, that story in all of its breadth and depth. So at some point in the future, we'll get there.
I applaud you for doing that. Don't forget ACT UP Kansas City.
Yeah.
And ACT UP Atlanta.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, ACT UP Kansas City did really important work on, I think, the local ordinances there. There's actually a graduate student who's done some work on that and produced a documentary film about ACT UP, ACT UP Kansas City. Yeah, I'll try to find a link to it for you.
Good.
Somebody from my infant gay life was crucial to ACT UP Kansas City.
Oh wow.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Dan and Duncan, for this thoughtful and stimulating dialogue, and to all of you who watched and made comments and asked questions. Within a few days, you will receive an email with a link to a recording of today's webinar that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you are interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, remember to check out the LGBTQ website, and particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future webinars, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinar on Tuesday evening, April 27th, will be a launch party for a new online exhibit for the Second Stone newspaper. Second Stone was a bi-monthly LGBTQ Christian newspaper published in the late 1980s and 1990s. LGBTQ is collaborating with publisher Jim Bailey to provide all of the issues of this historic newspaper in digital form that can be fully text searchable. So join us on April 27th to talk with Jim and get a preview of this exhibit. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations can hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. Once again, thank you, Dan and Duncan. Good night to all.
Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Asadi, for running support. Thanks to everybody who tuned in from home.